USA has been talking for some months about starting a video conferencing series that will allow members of the LGBT community an opportunity to hear from one another about how we live our Catholic faith. So this is the culmination of lots of work by folks like Logan Baird and Jim Smith and Shane, who was with us for a while, and we're just really pleased that you have joined us. Tonight, we are going to hear from one of the people in Dignity USA that I have long admired. Bill Baird was a founder of our Denver chapter back in 1973, and he has been a member of Dignity ever since, and has just, as anyone who knows him, he is a multi-talented, gracious and kind man, and just a wonderful representative of our movement. He is also now a member of Dignity USA's board of directors and chair of the National Convention Committee. He served in lots of other ways to help the Dignity community in San Francisco, as well as in Denver, and on convention work, and also as a national leader in our Defenders movement. So we're very, very pleased to have Bill with us tonight. Also, you'll be seeing Bill on screen very shortly. Also behind the scenes, I want to thank Logan Baird, our web minister, who is going to be helping us out with all the technical aspects of this fairly new venture for us. So Logan, thank you so much for your work. And as you see, we are interested in knowing sort of who's here joining us. So go ahead and click in on the question that's before you. You should right now be able to see an interactive poll on your screen. And as we proceed through the evening, you should be able to see Bill and myself on camera, and you should be able to hear both of us as well. If you are having trouble with the level of volume, you should be able to move your mouse over under the pictures, and a little volume screen will pop up, and you can set the volume level to where it's comfortable for you. In addition, we have set this session up so that Bill and I will chat about some questions for about 30-35 minutes. And then we'd really like to go in more in depth into topics that are of interest to our participants. So you can use the question and answer section of the screen that you should see in front of you to type in questions or comments. And as we kind of proceed through the evening, we'll try and get to them. Okay? So I am very pleased at this point to welcome Bill Baird to the screen. Bill, so nice to see you across the country. And Bill, I'm not hearing you. I don't know if others are.
Is that better?
There.
Great.
Yes, nice to hear you too.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, Bill, yeah, thank you so much for kicking off what we hope will be a monthly series and bringing, a very long experience in the tradition of being an out and proud gay Catholic to this conversation. I see that we're sort of split about half and half of folks who were around in the 70s and folks who sort of weren't quite living the gay life at that point. Maybe they were living the Catholic life. We'll have to see as we move forward through the night. But I'd like to know a little bit about your background. We found out tonight that you grew up in Iowa. And were you raised in a Catholic household? Was spirituality an important part of your
Well, it was certainly a part of my youth. I went to parochial school, grade school. My mother was Catholic, very involved in our local parish. My father was not. So we had sort of it was a mixed marriage, as they called it in those days. I went to a public high school, and I guess I really couldn't say that I had much of a spiritual background at that point. Certainly religion in terms of the Baltimore Catechism, but that was pretty much the extent of my, spiritual involvement.
It sounds like it became very important to you when you were in grad school in Denver.
Well, I moved to Boulder in 1973 to go to graduate school, Boulder, Colorado. And one of the purposes in moving to Boulder was to come out. It seemed to be a safe place to do that after having grown up in Des Moines. And I became involved with the Newman Center almost immediately. And then as I started the coming out process, one of the people that I confided in was the pastor of the Newman Center. So that sort of began my transition, both as coming out as a gay Catholic.
That sounds like it might have been a little scary in those days to choose the pastor to come out to, or did you have a sense that you'd get a welcome reception?
I did. It was the Newman Center was run by the Paulist priest, and I very much liked the attitude. I liked them as individuals, and so there was definitely a bit of concern. The other part of it, just on a personal level, was very awkward because I had also been dating the woman who was the music minister.
So you weren't really all
No, I was sort of one foot on both sides for a while, but she was very understanding, and we resolved that. So the pastoral staff there was extremely supportive. I was very fortunate for that. And at that point, Boulder Gay Liberation was a very active group, so I had a very, very good support system to be able to take advantage of as a coming out person.
Well, that's great. As you were coming out, did you have any sense that was incompatible with your religious self, your spiritual self, or was that not really a question?
Well, I certainly knew the church's position on homosexuality, but I also didn't particularly buy into that. So there was somewhat of a struggle, more for me in terms of knowing the church's view and just not agreeing with it, and how to reconcile that was an issue for me, yes.
Yeah. So tell us about how you first heard about Dignity. It was a very, very new and small organization.
Well, it was. Yes, it was, depending upon what you want to count, it was actually, Dignity, of course, was started in about 1969. But I actually learned about it through the pastor at the Newman Center. Shortly after I had come out to him, he showed me an article that had been in the NCR, National Catholic Reporter, about Dignity's first convention, which had taken place in 1973 in Los Angeles. And he thought I might be interested in it, and I certainly was, although I knew no more about it than was in the shared article in NCR. At that time, the office had just moved from Los Angeles to Boston, and so I wrote to the Boston office and got an immediate response and joined, sent my money in as an at-large member of Dignity. And at that point, I didn't know anyone who was in Dignity and had no other contact other than letters from the secretary of the organization at that time.
Wow, so this was really all done through the mail at that point.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
When did you, or how did you first meet other Dignity people?
Oh, well, that's another interesting story. My involvement with the Newman Center, through that, I was asked if I would be interested in going to a workshop on gay ministry that was being held in Dayton, Ohio, of all places, at the Bergamo Center. The Bergamo Center was run by the Mariannists as a retreat center, and they were holding what was the first workshop, 5-day workshop on gay ministry. Well, this was very daunting for me. I had no background in formal ministry, and certainly something going for 5 days seemed almost overwhelming to me, but they were willing to pay the fees and airline fare and everything else, and so I took off for Dayton, Ohio. And it was an amazing workshop. There were about 40 people, almost all of them involved in some kind of active ministry. And among the people who were there were Father Tom Odo, who was the Secretary of Dignity, and Jack Hart, the Treasurer. So that was my first, and a number of other people from Dignity chapters, so that was my first introduction to real people in Dignity.
And it sounds like at least some of the other folks were church, from the church, from the official church, priests and nuns and other folks like that who were early participants in this movement.
Oh, definitely. There were a number of priests there. The workshop was actually put on by Father Norbert Brockman, who was a Marianist priest. Among other people who were there were Brian McNaught, who had started the Detroit chapter of Dignity, and who at that time was still on staff for the Catholic paper in Detroit, was a columnist for the Catholic newspaper in Detroit. Other people I met included Sister Janine Gramick, who became a good friend as a result of that workshop.
Wow. I think sometimes we're surprised to know how much of this ministry was really supported by religious communities, by Catholic colleges and other organizations. What was your sense of where Dignity fit in with other things that were going on in the church around that time?
Well, the church was very much in a state of flux, I guess you might call it, certainly a period of renewal. It was leading up to Vatican. Okay, is that better, Thomas? It was leading up to Vatican II. And one of the things that was happening were a series of workshops around the country on justice and peace issues. And as we started the chapter in Denver, we became involved in that series of things. There were also a number of articles and books beginning to come out. John McNeil had published his first article, sort of a subsection of what became his book on the church and the homosexual, and that was published in 1973 in NCR, and that was just a major uplift for people.
Oh. I can imagine what that must have been like for there to have been nothing but negatives or silence for so long, and then all of a sudden this article of John's is out there, and in a paper that I understand was very, very widely read at that time.
Right. And there were other things happening. The Salvatorians out of Milwaukee had established a task force on gay ministry, and they published a series of support information in 1975. In fact, a couple of the Salvatorians were at the Bergamo retreat, and were very influential in presenting at that retreat also. So there were a number of things that were happening that were really very positive and very supportive.
It's exciting. Now, you mentioned that the Denver chapter was actually meeting in the cathedral. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was rather strange. So I'm told I'll try if that's better. We had a fairly favorable response from the Archdiocese initially. we had a contact with a priest who was an assistant priest at the cathedral, and actually offered if we would like to have liturgy there, which of course we immediately accepted. We were in the chapel, which happened to be in the basement, but it was a very nice chapel, sort of a private entrance, and we had Mass there every Sunday for many years, Sunday afternoon. And started off, of course, very slow, and I was happy if there were 3 or 4 people, but eventually we were up to 40 or 50 or 60 people on a given Sunday, and we had almost no trouble getting priests to celebrate with us. We had a number of priests who were formal members of the chapter, as well as a number of sisters. So it was a very almost schizophrenic time in some ways, because while the official church was still basically ignoring us, we had a lot of support within, especially within religious communities.
Wow. Can you remember how the word spread? How did people find out about Dignity meetings back in those early days?
Well, I know in Denver we started out just advertising the local gay newspaper. The beginning of the chapter was an ad that I put in, somewhat concerned because I was using my personal telephone number, and several of the people in Boulder Gay Lib thought that was awfully risky. I wasn't terribly concerned about it because I was a graduate student and really didn't have a lot to lose, although sort of a little story here, the day after the ad came out, my phone stopped working. Of course, this was in the days before cell phones and all of that. And it came back on about a day later, but there was clicking on my line, which lasted for about 2 months. So before anyone called and inquired about Dignity, or when they did call, I would immediately tell them that I assumed we were being listened to or taped, so only provide any information that they felt comfortable with. So there was a dark side going on at this time also.
Did you have a sense of who might be listening in, or did you ever get any confirmation that was happening?
No, it was just, as I say, after about 2 months, the clicking stopped, and I assumed they gave up.
Backing down. Wow. I know when I started in Dignity, it was in the early 80s, and even at that time, people in my home chapter would only use first names or would use a pseudonym or something of that nature. So for you to have put your real name and phone number out for folks, I can see how folks would have thought that was a little bit of a foolhardy thing to do.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. Yes. We have a comment from Jean Corpus. We have guests from Hawaii tonight. Thank you. Aloha, Hawaii. Noting that Dignity Denver is referenced in the book The Fancy Dancer by Patricia Nell Warren. Are you aware of that? You must
I
be.
was, and in fact I actually got to talk to her about that, and she commented that she had been to at least one, maybe more than one, of the Dignity Denver liturgies. I wasn't aware of her at that point, and don't have any particular remembrance of her having been there, but apparently she did join us. So yeah, it was quite interesting to see that we were specifically mentioned in her book.
Yeah. Interesting. That's actually that's the way I found out about Dignity as well, was through that book. So thank heavens for Dignity Denver. I don't know how many of us you brought to the movement, but at least one here. You also talked, as we were chatting, about some of your travels where you went to a number of places to meet up with the leadership of Dignity, with other members, to early conventions, to do volunteer work. Can you talk about some of those trips and some of the people that you met?
One of the first trips I made was actually to Detroit. I had met Brian McNaught at the Bergamo Center, and shortly after that, Brian was fired from the Michigan Catholic. and subsequently went on a hunger strike, which got a lot of notoriety around the country. But I went to Detroit specifically to ask Brian how he had started the chapter, what he had done, how he had, gotten it off the ground, and just to learn from him. So it was a great experience, and we're still friends almost 40 years later. And I also made a couple of trips to Boston. As I mentioned, the office had just started there. Paul Diederich was the president. Father Tom Oda was secretary. And the Boston chapter was certainly supportive, but there was no paid staff, and they had full-time jobs. And I had some free time in terms of being a graduate student, so I actually made a couple of trips to Boston just to work for a week in the office and try and do some of the paperwork, and of course everything was manual then. And the membership was just taking off. We were, by the Boston Convention, which was, let's say, 1975, we were at about 2,300 members. So fantastic growth in a very short period of time with almost no infrastructure to support it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You also said something I found really interesting, that there was a real belief that this organization wouldn't be needed within 20 years. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. We had this idea that if we educated the clergy, the bishops especially, and of course the priests, and that we had an outreach to the laity, that once they knew us and knew who we were and what we were, that we would be welcomed into the greater church, and there really wouldn't be a need for a support group such as, or educational group such as Dignity, that we would have done our work and the church would accept things and would take on the responsibility for support for gay and lesbian folks. That was obviously very naive on the part of many of us, and certainly by the 15-year mark, much less the 20-year mark, we were quite convinced that we had been very overly optimistic, we'll say, in what we had thought might happen for us.
But it does also give a sense of Dignity as sort of a very hopeful place, and very sort of mission driven, and how did that figure into things from the liturgy to the conventions, and how was that expressed?
Well, I was expressed both internally and externally. Again, by the growth rate continued, and by the time we got to the Chicago Convention in '77, we'd almost doubled again. We were close to 5,000 members and 70 chapters. It was just a phenomenal rate of growth. We were getting a lot of good publicity in National Catholic Reporter, and I think that the network of priests and women religious have been very supportive in getting the word out for us. The National Organization for Continuing Education for Priests had met in Denver, and we managed to get a publicity table at that convention. And another one of these sort of funny stories, but we were originally put into the vendor area, which was sort of off and away from everything else. And we were able to move our table out to the main foyer where everyone was, walking by, and we had coffee, and there was no coffee available, so we went through 4 pounds of coffee in 2 days, and hundreds and hundreds of styrofoam cups. But we had our display of information, and John McNeil's book was just out, and so we had copies of that for sale. And the priests would come and would pick up a cup of coffee, but there wasn't a whole lot of dialogue until Bishop Hunthausen from Seattle came over, and pulled over a chair and sat down and talked with us, and then pulled out his wallet and bought a copy of John McNeil's book. And this was in front of everyone. And after that, we had more people to talk with than we could possibly handle, and sold everything and gave away everything we had. So there were a lot of things happening that were very much supportive and uplifting.
And how did all of that influence your own sense of identity as a gay man and as a Catholic?
Well, it certainly was very positive. I guess the struggle continued to be the negatives that we heard. I had the opportunity in Denver a number of times to go out to the seminary, St. Thomas Seminary, at their invitation to speak. And while there was a positive response from a few people, overall I would say it was not a very positive response. So, I was certainly continually reminded of this duality, if you will, that while a lot of positive things were happening, the church in a larger form was not addressing the needs of gay, lesbian Catholics, and not even addressing their own needs internally. So on a personal level, there was still very much of a struggle, but there was so much positive happening that you sort of overlooked that, or at least I did.
You mentioned the words gay, lesbian, and I know back in those days we weren't as aware of the bisexual and transgender community. Were you aware of bisexual and transgender folks within Dignity in the early days?
Oh yes, the nomenclature hadn't kept up with what we would have now in terms of inclusive language, but one of the early members of the Denver chapter was a transgendered person. The language we use today probably wouldn't be quite as specific, because she was someplace between transgendered and a drag queen, but great person and very out there and up front, and very much a part of our community and very accepted by it. So again, we didn't quite have the language to use at that time, but Dignity was very accepting of people from a wide variety of sexual expressions and various places, and coming out in terms of their own experience.
Mm-hmm. And what are your memories of the relations between the women and men of the community throughout your experience within Dignity?
We were just all part of the same organization. We worked together very well. Now, the numbers were fairly few in terms of women. We had a number of women religious who were involved with us. And I would guess probably about, in the early days, maybe 25%, 20 to 25% of the chapter were probably women. But Dignity was, the Denver chapter at least, and from other chapters I was aware of, was primarily a male organization and probably male-centric, unfortunately. But that's, we were. But in terms of working environment, worked very well together. At the Chicago convention, which was the third convention, I got to know a woman by the name of Kathy Healy, who at that point was from Metro New Jersey, now from the San Francisco area, and she and I ended up sitting next to each other during the House of Consultors, which was sort of the delegates, the policy arm of the organization at that point. And we found we were very sympathetic with each other in terms of structure and what some things we thought the organization should be doing, and so we put a proposal together and ended up being asked to co-chair the Constitution Revision Committee out of the Chicago Convention.
That's great. So you were very involved in developing, part of the early structure that has kind of helped us build to where we are today. And as you look back on some of the things that you put in place, what were some of the really good decisions that you think were made by that group of consultors and the constitutional group?
Well, that's sort of almost a trick question because some of those things are no longer in place. But one of the first things we did was actually to establish a board of directors. Going into Chicago Convention, we didn't have a board of directors. We had the 3 officers. So we got agreement on the board of directors, and we established a regional structure. Again, we were growing at such a pace, and there was just absolutely no way that the national office could try to provide support or ministry across the country. And so we established 10 regions plus Canada as the 11th, because there were already, I think, 4 or 5 Canadian chapters at that point, and established 2 parts to the region. One was sort of the administrative person, and the other was more of the internal support person. And that provided the impetus then, and those people became part of the board. So the regional structure was very successful, and especially in the East and West, the regions themselves would have their own conferences, regional meetings, and became sort of the support chapter for neighborhood, the support organization for neighborhood chapters, so to speak, or area chapters. And the Pacific area, of course, was quite large. It's great to see Jean on with us today, because Hawaii was very instrumental in supporting the Region 10, the Pacific region. And they came over for all the regional meetings. Was really great.
I think today we don't any longer have a regional structure in Dignity. We haven't had that for not quite 10 years, but I think one of the things that people miss is the opportunity to gather with folks from outside their chapter, but who are still connected to the Dignity experience, and all that horizontal communication and relationship building that the regional events allowed for. And that's the kind of thing that I think the board is really struggling with right now. How do we foster that kind of connection? So I think we'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Well, I think we have a number of opportunities now we didn't have then. We have these kinds of communication tools that I think we can use. We have, the blogs and other kinds of social media that I think can be developed to at least gain some sense of that. And I think there may be reasons to look at other models for things like conventions or frequency of activities, and perhaps look at under perhaps the national auspices, but some kind of more regionally focused activities to try to bring some of that sense of camaraderie and support that we had in the regional days. But again, the organization now is 20-25% of what it was in that heyday period. So the needs are somewhat different, and I don't think we can just say that kind of a regional model would be appropriate today. I'm not trying to in any way imply that. So.
Yeah. Big question. Well, I'd like to shift gears a little bit from sort of the structural and historical questions and get a little bit more personal, I guess. As we noted, you have been, part of Dignity and in many ways a leader in Dignity through a lot of different phases of our organization, through this huge growth and tremendous hope, through the sense of, this has to be a long haul activity, through the HIV/AIDS crisis when we lost so many, through the late 80s when we started experiencing, real institutional attacks, through periods of stepping back and resurgence over and over again. And how has your sense of yourself, of Catholicism, of your spiritual sense, and of dignity, how has that all sort of stayed alive through all of those experiences?
Well, I guess I could say it stayed alive, but it certainly has had ebb and flows. I was obviously very involved in the 70s. In the 80s, I took somewhat of a sabbatical. I certainly was still involved with Denver, but I had met my partner, now husband, actually at a Dignity retreat, and had pulled back quite a bit from active involvement in Dignity. And then we moved to San Francisco, and of course the San Francisco chapter was established and very strong, with a lot of programs going on, and so my role was very different. I certainly participated in things, John and I did, but I became also involved at that point in our neighborhood parish in the area of San Francisco where we live, and we both did sort of a duality of being involved in both the in the Dignity structure, and myself it's still continued at the national level, but not as much in terms of the local chapter for quite a while. More recently, I think my spiritual growth has been a result of being involved in a small faith community outside of Dignity. And this group of 8 or 9 people has been meeting now for over 20 years in San Francisco, and that really has been a major focus of growth for me in terms of really understanding what the word spirituality means and what spiritual quest means.
Well, that's wonderful. You are also very involved in the Defenders, Dignity's outreach to the Leather Levi community. And, we've talked about the spiritual aspects of that and how spirituality is portrayed in the community. I think that's an area that a lot of people would have questions about or interest in.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about why it's important that Dignity have the Defenders, and how that adds to our life as a community and to your life as a person?
Wow, how many hours do we have?
Just get us started.
We'll try a little bit here. Much of leather as a concept is really about an enhanced set of personal visions, personal goals, personal spirituality, dealing with issues of trust and fulfillment and service in sort of almost another dimension. And it's very much a part, I think, of one's personal belief system and personal spirituality, and the development of that, I think, is very important, especially for people who come from a Catholic and Christian perspective. A lot of the monastic orders practice things that we would probably consider now to be almost on the verge of types of leather of some kind of, although they certainly wouldn't have seen it as that, but something to enhance those physical sensations of experience, and even of a sexual experience. And so I think the coming together of those of Christianity and Catholic faith and leather is a very intrinsic part of many of us who grew up especially in a Catholic tradition. The Defenders have about 5 chapters around the country now. Some of them smaller than others. Probably the 2 major ones are in Washington, D.C. and here in San Francisco. And each of these chapters has around between 15 and 20 active people in it right now.
Great. And they've certainly produced a lot of phenomenal leaders for Dignity that we're very grateful for. For the folks who have been listening patiently, now's the time to go ahead and start, jumping in with questions. You can use the Q&A section of your screen to send a comment, send a question, and while folks are typing, Bill, I'd just like to ask, how do you describe your current place in your spiritual journey? Are there particular, you mentioned your small faith group, that being important to you. What other kinds of things are part of your spiritual life at the moment?
Well, I guess part of my definition of my spiritual life now is very much a change in my view of the Roman Church. I'm certainly very comfortable with it. I grew up with it. I believe in the basic call and mission of Christ in my life, but I have very little to do with the hierarchy. There certainly are some wonderful priests and women religious who perform great services and great ministry, and I try to continue, and John and I are very supportive of individual aspects of the traditional Catholic Church. And I still nominally call myself a Catholic, I suppose, but certainly for me, the kind of spiritual sense that Dignity fosters and that I find in my local parish and in the small faith community that's a part of that, is where I get my sustenance. It doesn't happen from the traditional church structure, and that's really almost irrelevant to me what the Vatican says these days.
Is your small faith community one that celebrates Eucharist, or does it meet more for kind of spiritual sharing? How does that work?
We meet for spiritual sharing, and we do a lot of readings, a lot of books, books by people like Sister Joan Chittister, and occasionally every year we pick sort of a new topic, and we've done the Gospels now, and as I say, we've been together almost 20 years. So we do a variety of things. We don't do a formal communion service of any kind, although we do have dessert every week, which is sort of our communal celebration, as it were. And it's interesting that, as I say, we came out of the local parish. Of the 8 of us, 4 are no longer active involved in the Catholic Church at all. And so there are really 4 who are and 4 who are not, and that's fine. It's immaterial to our personal journey, whether or not one is actively involved.
Yeah. One of the questions that I've started asking people is not, are you Catholic or do you go to church, but how do you express your Catholicism?
Right.
Because I think so many of us carry that sense of Catholicism with us in different ways, and it's still very vibrant, but is lived out in many, many different ways.
Yes.
So, yeah. Okay. I see. Okay. I am not seeing any questions sent, so if folks are typing, I don't know where those are going. We're seeing a poll that says 2 people have some questions, but we're not sure where they're being sent. This is why we're doing this session. It's one of the reasons we're doing this session, is to see what bugs we have, and this is clearly one of them. So maybe folks, if you do have questions and you didn't put them on the chat, maybe try the chat and we'll work that through. Yes, one of the folks that you know well, Bill, is Jim Busson. Yes, he was a leader in the late 70s and throughout the 80s, and has been suffering from a very unusual kind of cancer. And Michael, thank you for that reference. Right. Yes, asking us all to pray for Jim.
Yeah,
we'd like to that going. Okay. Why does Bill feel that dignity no longer fulfills his spiritual need? I think that's a question a lot of people have we see people kind of coming in and coming out of the community a lot, which sounds like something that happened in your journey. There are certainly times when you had to step away. What is it that you weren't getting from Dignity that you got in other places, Bill?
It's a little difficult to say. Some of it is just sort of time and place, and it isn't that, certainly the San Francisco Dignity chapter is very vibrant and offers a variety of activities, including liturgy every Sunday. In fact, I'll be going this coming Sunday. But my personal position just is not that much in terms of going to liturgy, actually. It's much more in the faith-sharing environment. And so it isn't that I couldn't have found it, but within Dignity. It's just for me personally, in my particular situation in San Francisco, there were other opportunities and that I've chosen to take advantage of. So I wouldn't want it to be construed as being a negative. It's just, my particular journey has been, I guess, rich in terms of having multiple opportunities.
Yep. Yeah. I think that's true for a lot of folks. As I said, coming and going, or finding that a journey takes a spiritual path. Again, I think there's that's a difference from sort of institutional Catholicism.
Right.
That one community probably won't fulfill people's
right.
faith needs for their
Agreed.
entire lives.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yep. Okay. I have a couple of others. Tiara, I have information that Tiara asked a question, but unfortunately I cannot see it, Tiara. Again, I'm not sure what. Oh, here we go. Pax Nydorf, the founder of Dignity USA, said, "We are all faced with a series of great opportunities brilliantly disguised as impossible situations. What do you think are some of the impossible situations facing Dignity chapters today? And what opportunities do they present?" What a fantastic question.
You want me to go first, Marianne?
Please.
I think probably two of the major obstacles right now for Dignity is simply the term Catholic. That the hierarchical church has done such an incredible job of undermining the basis that so many of us believe in terms of what it means to be a Catholic and should mean to be a Catholic, both with the sexual abuse scandals and then just in general in terms of their entrenchment and the almost revoking of many of the things that came out of Vatican II. So that I think it becomes very difficult for many people to understand why you would even want to consider the word Catholic in your spiritual life. And I think that's a major obstacle that the Dignity has to, as an organization, continue to face, and certainly the board is talking about and will continue to talk about. I guess the other thing continues, which is somewhat related to that, but is the church's continual unwillingness to acknowledge the role of women that women should have in the church, especially in terms of active ministry, and that it is a challenge for Dignity to embrace that and encourage women in active ministry within Dignity, which I think we have been doing, and certainly our conventions have been opportunities to let that happen.
That's great. I just also want to mention that one of the things the board has done in the last year is issue some strategic planning grants to some of our chapters, both small and large chapters, to look at exactly the question of sort of what are the challenges and how might we address them, and we should be getting some results in during 2012, and hopefully some of those findings will help with planning for the future on a local level, because Dignity is in a very different world and a different church than it was in when most of our chapters were founded, and our models I don't think have always kept up, so it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. Just another comment here, from this one from Bill Welch, our dearly loved Bill Welch from California. Just wanted to mention the sexual ethics study. Yes. That was a big issue that I think a lot of people may not know about anymore. Bill, can you say a little bit about the sexual ethics study?
Yeah, the House of Delegates, and I believe it might have been in the first Seattle convention, but actually commissioned a working group, a task force, and to develop it became a working paper on sexual ethics from a gay Catholic perspective. And it was a very, esteemed group of people that came together and produced that paper, which Dignity USA then published. And I'm sure I have a copy of it someplace. At that time, it got a fair amount of publicity, both certainly in the gay community, but also in the religious press. NCR did a lot of publicity of the paper.
I think it's actually available on the Dignity USA website. If people type in Sexual Ethics Task Force Report in the search engine, it'll come up. It's great. Well, obviously there's a lot of ground we could cover here, but I'd like to try and bring this to a little bit of a close right now, and encourage people, if you would like to continue some of this conversation, Dignity USA does have several places where you can do that, but I'd like to direct you to voices.dignityusa.org. I hope I did that right, Logan, where you can sign in and participate in chat or blogging about the history of Dignity USA, where we get our spiritual needs met, how our participation in Dignity at particular points in history shapes our identity as LGBT or Catholic, or anything else that was triggered by tonight's session. Bill, I really want to thank you for being willing to start us off here with such rich reflections on a time that many of us didn't have the opportunity to experience. And it just reminds me that we're fortunate enough to still have people within Dignity who were around in the late 60s and early 70s, and who are willing to tell those stories, and we really need to document that history.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I just want to put a sort of a plug for anyone who's really interested in this. And most of this information from this booklet is actually on the Dignity USA website, but I'm going to hold up a little pamphlet here.
Yes.
The early 25 years of Dignity that Pat Roche from the Seattle chapter and past president of Dignity put together. And it's an incredible job of looking back at the history. And a lot of the numbers that I mentioned today came out of his booklet, and as I say, are on the website. It really is a great resource for us.
It is. It's terrific documentation. Logan, thank you for clarifying. Again, it's voices.dignityusa.org, which is the place to, you can go and Twitter. Of course, our website, www.dignityusa.org, and you can always follow Dignity on Dignity USA and many of our chapters on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you again to you, Bill, Logan, and Jim, who've worked long and hard to make this a reality. Thank you for your participation tonight. To those of you who participated, thank you for your interest in doing this and for signing on. It's wonderful to look at the list and see we literally have people from New Jersey and Florida through the middle of the country all the way to Honolulu. So we really are covering the entire breadth of the country here, which is terrific. As I said, this is the inaugural edition of Queer Catholic Faith. We will be putting out a schedule soon of the next 3 to 4 of these events that will be happening, and could really use your feedback on how this session went. Feel free to email webminister@dignityusa.org with any comments about your experience, if you had trouble with reverb, if the pictures weren't clear, if we tried to cover too much, too little, any feedback that you have that will help us shape this. We really appreciate it. And also, this session has been recorded, and once we click off, and we will be able to access the link to that recording, and we'll be making that information available as well. So if there are people that you think would really like to hear some of this material, please go ahead and send them that link once we get it out. Again, if you entered your link, we will send you a link to the recording, and we'll also put it out on our various social media events so folks can see it. So thank you very much for spending part of your night with Dignity USA. Appreciate
Thank you, everyone.
Very, very much.
Good night.
Good night.